This is the first in a series of 4 short narrated PowerPoints on the concepts of sampling, reliability, validity, and statistical power. These were all concepts that were covered to some degree in your assigned readings from Kim and Mallory, but I want to flesh out these and give you what I think of as a more basic, plain language description of what I think are some important aspects that were missing from your reading. I believe that understanding these concepts in a basic way will help you understand study designs and the methods that we use in a study, and that will help you in your future readings for this course. It will help you read the literature and have a different understanding of it, and importantly, it will help you think differently about your capstone, having these understanding these foundational concepts. So let's start with the first one as content on sampling. So I'd like to start with a few definitions. Kim and Mallory talked about this difference between a population and a sample. So when we do a study, we're often interested in doing that study for a certain population. And so, for example, people who are at risk for type 2 diabetes would be a population that we might be interested in. Now, obviously, that's a very large population if we would look at all those people across the United States or even within a state. And so researchers will select a sample that's feasible for a study. And that sample is this subset. But what we want is a representative sample. So we're getting at this second term here. And that's a sample whose characteristics are comparable to those of the population. This will make more sense when we get a little further. So right now we're keeping kind of at a surface understanding. And one of the things we need to be careful of is the methods we use in sampling can influence how representative that sample is. And so if we're not careful with our sampling methods, we can introduce more what they call sampling bias. And these are these distortions that can happen when a sample is not representative of that population. So let's define the terms that are here. These definitions come from this textbook, Nursing Research, which is a highly regarded textbook on nursing research and methods. So we've already talked about the meaning of a population. They include a term called the target population. And so what they're emphasizing by this is that often a population, that entire aggregate of cases, is simply too large to even think about generalizing a study to a population that large, because there's so many ways that population can differ from each other. And so they use this term of target population to define that group of cases that you want to be able to generalize your results to. You want to say, my results pertain to these participants down here, these participants in my study. I can say that these apply to this target population. So the next step down is to think about who in that target population that you can access. Now that's a pretty interesting question. So let's say your target population are patients having a certain condition in the hospital or clinic where you work. Chances are if you get permission to your study, that's a pretty accessible population to you. Accessible due to having contact information, addresses, but other populations, and a good example in your test textbook would be homeless people in, let's say, even in a city that's as small as Madison. Imagine the difficulty of counting who's even there in that target population to say who you have access to. This term sampling frame is a term that pertains to random sampling. So random sampling was a term that was discussed in your text, and that's when you use a method to select people from your sample. That means that everybody has an equal chance of being selected. You can use a random number generator. They talked about drawing slips of paper out of a hat, but something that means that everybody has an equal chance of being in your study. And if you are going to use random sampling, it's typical to use a sampling frame where you've got this numbered list, and then use some method where you're randomly selecting those people who you want to be in your sample. And the sample is defined as those who were selected from your accessible population, whether you use some of the sampling methods that were described in your textbook, such as convenient sampling, or some of the other methods, and these are the people that you are going to either invite to be in your study, or simply you're selecting them to be in your study. So for example, if you're using data from electronic methods, in some cases you don't need to invite them. You have access to those records, and you can sample from those records to decide who you want to include. And then finally, those participants who are actually in your study, if you invited them, they said, yes, I will be in your study, and they actually participated, the people you have data for are the participants. So the goal, when we're finished with sampling, is to have participants who are representative of the target population. We want the characteristics of our participants to be similar to the characteristics of a target population. So first of all, how do we assess that? How can we assess the degree to which our participants are representative? Well, one good idea is to look for what we think of as data, demographic data on these characteristics. Typical characteristics that we collect in a survey or that we might try to get from a medical record are things such as age, sex, level of education, income if possible. Sometimes there's other data that we collect to help us decide if we have a representative population, and those are things we want to collect that data if possible so we can assess that characteristic of our participants. How representative are they? We also need to think about, and this is just something that we need to be able to think about and describe, is who isn't included at each of these steps. So for our accessible population, are important people missing? And we need to disclose that when we describe our study methods. We also need to think very carefully about those sampling methods we want to use, and you read about those methods in your textbook. We talked about those various types of random sampling, one being stratified, one not. We talked about the non-random methods of collecting a sample, one being that idea of meeting a quota of certain people in certain groups. So you should think about those very carefully when you're selecting your methods to pick an appropriate sampling method to get a representative sample. And then I'd like to also point out that I think this is an excellent reference at the end. It's a website on research methods, and I found that students find it helpful. They just describe some of the same things we're talking about, and some of the same things you'll be reading about in a different way, and that's always helpful. So this concludes the talk on sampling, and it'll be important for you to watch those next 3 narrated videos, and the idea of sampling will be a topic that is brought up in the 4th and final video when we talk about external validity.